Boldwood presents The Cursed Writer, written by Holly Hepburn and read by Sophie Roberts. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. It began, as so many adventures did, with the arrival of a telegram for Sherlock Holmes. That the message was for Holmes was not unusual. Harry White opened and read hundreds of similarly addressed letters each week, and she had, by and by, grown used to the idea that so many otherwise sensible and intelligent people believed the celebrated master detective was a real person. They came from all walks of life as far as she could tell, earnestly writing to seek assistance with all manner of mysteries and suspected crimes. And since the newly built head offices of the Abbey Road Building Society spanned the detective's famous Baker Street address, that was where the letters were delivered. They had accumulated in the post-room of the bank for months, growing in volume every day, until it became clear something needed to be done about them. By dint of an unpleasant but well-timed collision between Harry's knee and her lascivious manager's groin, she found herself unceremoniously demoted from the plush upper floors of the bank to the basement, and what she supposed was the most menial role an enraged Simeon Pemberton had been able to find. For the best part of 2 months, Harry had worked her way through the backlog of letters, responding to each in the same brief but sympathetic manner. Mr. Holmes has retired to Sussex to keep bees and is regretfully unable to help. At least her reply to almost each letter had been the same, and a glance at that morning's newspaper headlines reminded her she did not regret a single moment that had followed from her one deviation, even if her true role in the events that followed would never be publicly known. But the arrival of a telegram for Holmes stood out from the other correspondence by virtue of its novelty as well as its urgency, and it caused Harry to sit up straight at her desk to open it. Sherlock Holmes. Philip St. John at death's door. Time of the essence. Reply immediately. It came from a John Archer, Esquire, of Thrumwell Manor in Cambridgeshire, and although Harry read it 4 times, she still felt herself none the wiser. The telegram was reserved for news and information of vital importance, and at face value, a mortal illness certainly qualified. Moreover, Philip St. John was a man of considerable literary repute. Both her father and grandfather had waxed lyrical about his novels, and her mother had complained on more than one occasion that he had snubbed all her invitations to the illustrious dinner parties she threw at their family home, Abinger Hall. The revelation of his apparent indisposition was both unexpected and alarming. But Harry could not fathom why this Mr. Archer had felt the need to advise Sherlock Holmes of the unhappy situation, and to spend a not insignificant amount in doing so. Even if she overlooked the fact that Holmes did not exist, surely Dr. Watson was the more qualified resident of 221B Baker Street in matters of health. Perhaps Archer suspected foul play and wanted Holmes to investigate. But if that were the case, why not say so? Shaking her head in bewilderment, Harry read the terse message again. It made little sense, which she supposed at least put it in the same category as much of the other correspondence she dealt with on a daily basis. What she ought to do was place it at the bottom of the date-ordered pile and respond in the usual way when it reached the top, without being swayed by the urgency of the message. But even as she forced herself back to the task of opening yet more envelopes, she knew she could not ignore the telegram that long. It smouldered like a sullen coal beneath a blanket of tinder. Sooner or later, it would catch light, and she would need to attend to it. Despite the burning presence, it took Harry until 3 o'clock that afternoon to finally give in. The latest batch of correspondence was typical of that received by Holmes, veering between the scandalous, the libellous, and the merely dull, but it did succeed in distracting her. A woman in Margate was unsure whether the man she was set to marry was who he claimed to be. A gentleman in Dulwich alleged his neighbour had poisoned his honeysuckle. Another asked for help in retrieving his late father's missing last will and testament, promising a handsome reward if Holmes was able to restore his rightful inheritance. Harry allowed herself a moment to imagine how the detective might approach the case. Undoubtedly, he would deduce within seconds that there was more to the matter than vanished paperwork. At first glance, it appeared Mr. Stubbs might be the victim of an unscrupulous relative who had stolen his father's fortune, but the jagged zigzag of his signature would tell Holmes the man was hiding a dark personality and could not be relied upon for the truth. And then Harry felt a faint sting of guilt, because Mr. Stubbs was not a character in a Sherlock Holmes story, but a real person in some distress. She had no right to second-guess the circumstances that had brought him to write to Holmes. Reining her imagination in, she filed it at the bottom of the pile and settled herself into typing up standard responses. But her fingers, usually speedy and nimble, felt slow and fat. All too often the keys jammed, creating letters that were smudged and littered with mistakes, forcing her to start again. The constant clack, clack, clack sounded like pistol shots, and to make matters worse, she had the start of a headache that she suspected was due to a lack of sleep and an overabundance of excitement. And every time she closed her eyes, John Archer's words swam before her eyes. "Time is of the essence. Reply immediately." At length she sat back and was instantly overtaken by a yawn so vast and unladylike that she was grateful she had no colleagues to witness it. Giving up on her infernally possessed typewriter, Harry reached for her notepad. Surely it wouldn't hurt to ask Mr. Archer for more information, if only to set her own mind at rest. After several attempts, she managed to draft a reply that was probing yet succinct. Conscious of the need for brevity, she decided against mentioning Holmes's retirement and focused instead on the question of why Mr. Archer had sought his help at all. "Sincere condolences. Request more details to assist. S.H." Once the message was crafted to Harry's satisfaction, she checked the return address on the telegram from John Archer and added it to her notebook, below the message she had composed. As another yawn overtook her, she decided enough was enough. She had not taken her lunch break after all. Gathering up her belongings, she locked the door of her tiny office and made for the fresh air of Baker Street. Newspaper sellers called out the headlines of the evening edition. "American drug lord arrested at Southampton. Read all about it." "Suspect released in Lord Robertson robbery. Read all about it." Harry couldn't help glancing at the newspapers as she passed. Her own role in exposing the criminal gang behind Lord Robertson's burglary was a closely guarded secret, and the whole sequence of events that had led to her chasing the true culprit around the alleys of South London felt like a bad dream, although she still had the bruises to remind her it had been real. All that mattered was that justice had been done, and the innocent maid accused of the crime had been set free. At the post office, Harry transferred her message to a telegram form and slid it beneath the grill to the clerk. "Standard or greeting?" he asked, without looking up. Greetings telegrams were reproduced on decorative paper by the receiving post office and were commonly used for birthday messages, congratulations, and other good wishes. Harry could only imagine what Holmes, or even John Archer, might make of such frivolity. "Standard, please." The clerk nodded. 2 shillings and 6pence, if you please." Harry paid the fee without complaint, glad she had chosen not to use the telephone in her office to reply to Mr. Archer. The cost would have been added to the bank's bill, and while she felt reasonably confident it would have gone unnoticed among all the other correspondence sent on official Abbey Road Building Society business, it was much better not to leave any trace of her actions. Harry's immediate manager, Mr. Babbage, who ran the post room, had once warned her she had a powerful enemy within the bank, and she had no wish to draw attention to herself. And if she was caught in such a flagrant breach of bank procedure, it would mean instant dismissal. The faint flutter of anxiety that thought caused stayed with her all the way home to her small but elegant apartment in Hamilton Square. For the second time in her official capacity as secretary to Sherlock Holmes, she had deviated from her duties as required by the bank. For the second time, her curiosity had been roused, leading her to indulge a most un-Holmes-like whisper of intuition that nagged at her in much the same way as Esme Longstaff's letter about her missing sister had some months earlier, prompting her to launch her first investigation into the case of the missing maid. And for the second time, in spite of her anxiety, Harry felt certain she had done the right thing. Harry was intrigued, but not surprised by the speed of John Archer's response. It came by telegram the next afternoon, much to the interest of Bobby the postboy, who presented it to her with an expression of unbridled curiosity. "Another urgent message for Sherlock Holmes," he said, wide-eyed beneath his red velvet cap. "It must be something serious." "Thank you, Bobby," Harry said mildly, taking care to ensure her expression revealed nothing of her own interest in the contents. He waited, an expectant look on his face, until it became clear she wasn't going to open it. "Have an heart, Miss White," he begged. "The lads in the post room gave me hell yesterday when I said I didn't know what the big mystery was." Harry placed the telegram on the desk in front of her. "We receive hundreds of letters to Sherlock Holmes every week. Do they ask you about those?" Bobby scratched his chin. "No, but a telegram, 2 telegrams even, that's different." He paused. "My money's on murder." "You've been reading too many detective stories," Harry said, mildly amused by his ghoulish certainty. "Assuming this telegram is from the same person as yesterday, then I can assure you it is nothing so sensational, and it is quite common for those who seek the help of Mr. Holmes to write more than once." Bobby shrugged, apparently unconvinced. "Letters are cheaper than telegrams. Whoever sent it really wants your attention." "Not my attention," she corrected gently. "The attention of Sherlock Holmes, who is unable to help, for obvious reasons." "But what if it really is murder?" the boy persisted. "Shouldn't you tell the peelers?" Harry thought about the hundreds of letters she had read, alleging everything from embezzlement to grave robbing, and it was true that several had claimed to have uncovered the darkest crime. But in those cases, they had only turned to Holmes after the police had refused to entertain them, and Harry felt certain their accusations must have already been investigated. Besides, she did not want to encourage the idea in Bobby's head that she might do anything other than answer the letters in the way Mr. Babbage had instructed her. She liked the postboy, but she had no idea whether she could trust him or anyone else at the bank. "The people who write to Mr. Holmes are not, well, let us say they are confused about what is real and what isn't." She held up a hand as Bobby opened his mouth to object. "But it isn't my job to pass judgment on them, nor to consider the truth of what they say. I open their letters, I read them, and I send a standard reply." She crossed her fingers under the desk. "Without exception, not even telegrams." He frowned. "You must get some real nutters writing to him." "Some of them are a little strange," Harry conceded. "But I suppose it's simply a testament to the excellence of the stories. They draw the readers in, make them want to believe someone as brilliant as Sherlock Holmes could be real." "Maybe," Bobby said. "Do you reckon other detectives get letters then? Miss Marbles and that?" Harry smiled. "Possibly, but not all of them have such a famously recognizable address." "Lucky for you that he does," Bobby observed, then blinked nervously as Harry stared at him. After what happened and all. With your last position, I mean." Harry knew her expression must be glacial, but she couldn't seem to unfreeze it. She hadn't realized the reason for her move to the post room was common knowledge. "What exactly do you mean?" He shifted from one foot to the other. "I don't mean nothing, Miss White, except that it's a good thing there's all these letters to answer in this little room, so you can keep out of his way. I don't doubt that he didn't dare give you the sack, not after what happened the last time." He trailed off, staring at the floor as Harry's thoughts jumbled together and cleared. "The last time," she repeated slowly. "You're telling me there was someone Mr. Pemberton harassed before me?" But even as she said it, she knew it must be true. A man like Simeon Pemberton had a lecherous eye and a great opinion of his own worth. He would undoubtedly have used his position of power to bestow his attentions on other young women at the bank. Bobby cleared his throat and glanced over his shoulder into the corridor, as though checking he could not be overheard. "A secretary in the typing pool. She didn't... What I mean to say is, she left of her own accord, but the other women all knew what had happened." He eyed Harry expectantly. She drew in a breath and forced herself to be patient. "Which was what?" "That she didn't say no, like you did," Bobby said in a low voice. "People started to talk. She couldn't keep working at the bank then, not with him being married." She shook her head. "How long ago was this?" Bobby pursed his lips. "Must have been 6 or 7 months ago now. I'm surprised you didn't hear about it." But Harry was not surprised. As Mr. Pemberton's personal assistant, she had kept herself to herself on the bank's upper floors, preferring not to indulge in gossip. She'd known some of the women in the secretarial pool by name, recognised more to nod to in the corridors, but she wouldn't have known if one had left, not even under such a cloud. And then Harry herself had fallen victim to Mr. Pemberton, although her own experience hadn't been anything like as terrible. Even so, it appeared she had been the subject of gossip too. "But what happened to her?" Harry asked. "No one knows," Bobby said, shaking his head. "One of the secretaries who'd been friends with her called at her lodgings and discovered she'd left. Maybe she went back to her parents." Which would probably have meant admitting she had lost her job, Harry thought. "Poor girl," she murmured. "And Pemberton forced her out?" Bobby gave a short laugh. "Not directly. He made it seem like it was her choice to leave. But that's why he couldn't risk sacking you, see? If you'd started blabbing, well, the gossip would have been even worse. The higher-ups might have heard about it, and questions might have been asked." Harry nodded to herself. Hadn't Pemberton said as much when he'd dispatched her to the basement? "I would remind you that everything occurring within these walls remains highly confidential." And she had kept quiet, determined not to let him force her out, even though the repetitiveness of typing the same letter almost drove her mad. Until she'd opened the letter from Mildred Longstaff's sister, and everything had changed. "I reckon he thought you wouldn't last a week down in the post room," Bobby went on. "But Mr. Babbage was too sharp for him. He found you this place instead. That's what I mean by lucky, see?" Harry stared at him, then gave herself a mental shake. It wasn't his fault. Compared to the other secretaries, she had got off lightly, and she still had a job, albeit considerably less well paid, as she'd discovered when she received her first wage slip after her altercation with Mr. Pemberton. But that didn't matter so much. Bobby couldn't know Harry worked because she wanted to, not because she needed to. The granddaughter of a baron was not expected to earn a living. But the alternative was submitting to her mother's well-meaning efforts to find her a suitable husband, and the very thought of that made Harry shudder. Married women were expected to give up their jobs to devote themselves to their husband, and the kind of match Harry was expected to make also came with the distinct requirement of providing an heir. It wasn't that she was against marriage, if she met the right person, but she was not ready to give up her freedom yet. Working at the bank allowed her to live in London and enjoy some independence, away from the watchful eye of her mother. It had also enabled her to reunite Mildred with her family and reveal the criminal gang who had set her up. Perhaps Bobby was wiser than he knew, Harry thought ruefully. She had enjoyed an awful lot of luck in her life so far. Yes, I do see, she said quietly. I am very grateful to Mr. Babbage, and to you too, for helping me to settle in so well. He nodded, although she thought his chest puffed up a little under the smart burgundy jacket. You sure you can't give me a hint about what's in that telegram? Harry smiled at his persistence. Quite sure. See you later, Bobby. Maybe, he said, and turned towards the door with a melodramatic sigh. If the lads in the post room don't kill me first. Chapter 2. Harry sat at her desk for quite some time, staring at the rectangular telegram without truly seeing it. Her thoughts were jumbled, mostly focused on Bobby's revelation about the poor woman who had paid the price for Simeon Pemberton's lustfulness. Would he risk attempting to seduce another of the bank's employees? It seemed likely, although the fact that Harry was still a member of staff might help to deter him. Should she have spoken up instead of meekly accepting her demotion? If she had, it was likely both she and the other secretary would be unemployed. But perhaps so would Mr. Pemberton. Was that a sacrifice Harry ought to have made? Still troubled, she turned her attention to the telegram, hoping it might distract her. The message was shorter than the previous one and contained only 4 words. Garston Club, tomorrow, 5 p.m. Harry sat back in her chair. She had hoped Archer might give more information about why he sought the help of any detective, let alone Holmes, but he had only deepened the mystery. Rather than satisfy her curiosity, the imperious summons to the Garston Club in Piccadilly only fanned the flames of her interest. If such a telegram had arrived at 221B Baker Street in a Conan Doyle story, Holmes would undoubtedly have been similarly intrigued, which she supposed might have been Archer's intention. The trouble was that Harry could not go to the meeting, not as Harry White, nor using the pseudonym of R.K. Moss, the name she had invented for the secretary of Sherlock Holmes. She could not go because she was a woman, and under the Garston Club's archaic but inflexible rules, women were expressly forbidden to enter. It boasted an impressive list of members, Harry knew. Her 2 elder brothers had both undergone the strict vetting process to join the ranks of well-known actors, authors, artists, and aristocrats who met there. The fact that this John Archer was also a member only increased Harry's puzzlement. If the grand-sounding address of Thrumwell Manor had not signalled he was a man of some importance, his membership of the Garston Club made it clear, and once again Harry found herself wondering what he hoped to gain by contacting Holmes. But it appeared the pieces of the puzzle would only be revealed in full by meeting him, and that was what frustrated Harry the most. Could she send a telegram requesting an alternative venue? Archer might very well do it for the great Sherlock Holmes, but it would mean the arrival of yet another telegram at the bank, which would raise still more questions in the post room, and Harry would rather not undergo another interrogation from Bobby. Tapping her fingers thoughtfully on the desk, she considered the problem. What would Holmes do if he were in her shoes? The answer was obvious and offered no help at all. He would simply meet Archer at the Garston Club, because he could go anywhere and do anything by virtue of being a man. Moreover, he had Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to remove such inconveniences with a clever sentence or 2. Harry had no such advantages. She would have to decline the meeting, and hope Archer did not decide to present himself at 221B Baker Street, demanding to see the detective in person. He might even produce the telegram she had sent on behalf of Holmes, which, while laughable, might also set alarm bells ringing among those who knew the bank did indeed employ a secretary to Sherlock Holmes. There was, in short, a risk that the trail might lead back to Harry, and she would find it extremely difficult to explain the coincidence away. And it was a scenario she felt all the more likely to occur if she did not cancel the meeting and no one turned up to meet Archer at the Garston Club. Harry rubbed her temples, wincing as her fingers brushed the bruises that were a souvenir of her desperate chase through London a few days earlier. She was beginning to regret following the impulse to reply to Archer at all. Harry did her best to focus on her work, but as the afternoon wore on, the problem gnawed at her. The unpredictability of what might unfold, if she followed either course of action, troubled her. Both carried risk, and she couldn't settle on the best path. But eventually, she decided with regret that the meeting must be cancelled, and in such a way that it was clear that no further correspondence would be undertaken. It was, she thought, something of a shame not to learn more about Mr. Archer's problem, but there was no help for that. She could not meet him, yet couldn't chance going. The only way to nullify the danger was draw a line under the matter entirely. She remained convinced of this as she made her way once more to the post office and copied the message she had composed onto the telegram form. Regret, unable to help. Matter now closed. S.H. Her determination did not waver as she joined the queue, which was longer than it had been the day before and slow-moving. Harry allowed her mind to drift, studying the other customers to pass the time. The woman directly before her was clearly impatient, tapping a well-heeled shoe and huffing. From the back, Harry guessed she might be in her 40s. Her coiled hair was shot with grey. A fellow secretary, she decided, impatient to complete her errand and be away home. The man ahead of her was tall and smartly dressed in a pinstripe suit with dark grey trilby hat that covered most of his head. He carried himself stiffly with 2 brown paper packages under one arm, leaning heavily on a mahogany walking stick. Perhaps he was a war veteran, Harry thought, watching him move slowly forwards in the queue. Holmes would know from his gait exactly which part of his leg had been injured, and from that deduce which of the armed forces he had served in. There would be some other barely perceptible clue that told him where the man had served. But for Harry, who had no superhuman intellect to rely on, there were no such remarkable revelations. She might not even be correct in assuming he had been injured in the Great War. His disability could have been caused by a car crash, a workplace accident, a debilitating illness. But she thought there was something military in his straight back and proud bearing. And then he turned his head to the left, only a little, and she caught the unnatural curve of a smooth, hard cheek. It was painted to mimic the colour of the man's skin tone, but somehow that only made it more obvious to Harry. The breath caught in her throat as she hurriedly looked away, feeling suddenly intrusive. So many men had returned from the war horrifically disfigured, and not all were able to face the world again, even with metal masks to hide the damage or skin grafts to try and repair it. That this man could was a testament to courage. She watched him turn to face the front, noting how many of those around him averted their gaze. Such men were undoubted heroes, but even 14 years on, they were also an uncomfortable reminder of the terrible cost the war had exacted. A price some would continue to pay for the rest of their lives. The queue moved again, although not fast enough for the woman in front of Harry, who muttered under her breath. The man with the walking stick shuffled forward, but seemed to get his cane tangled with his foot. He stumbled, throwing his arms wide in an attempt to regain his balance, and the packages he carried tumbled to the ground. The secretary tutted loudly, making no move to help. Really? Harry's cheeks began to burn with indignation. She stepped past the woman and flashed a smile at the man, who was trying with some difficulty to recover his parcels. Here, let me. Once she had scooped them up, she held them out, allowing him to gather them awkwardly under his free arm. She looked fully at him then, saw that the metal mask extended across more than half his face, covering both eyes and the whole of one cheek. It disappeared beneath his hat, and Harry supposed the trilby must be helping to keep it in place. His eyes were dark behind the holes, but they fixed on Harry, and she thought he was trying to return her smile, although his mouth barely twitched. "Thank you," he said, the words a little indistinct. "That's quite all right," Harry replied. "Will you be able to manage? I can help if you'd like." Fresh tutting broke out behind them. "Don't think you're jumping the queue, miss," the secretary said, and Harry looked back to see a hard-faced woman whose expression was even more sour than her tone. "I know your game." Harry lifted her chin. "My game, as you put it, is helping this gentleman, nothing more." The other woman scowled. "Just as long as you remember your place, it's behind me." She jerked her head at the man. "He can join you there if he needs help." Drawing a deep, calming breath, Harry summoned up a cool smile. "That won't be necessary." She turned her attention back to the man, who had been following the exchange in silence. "I'm happy to carry your parcels to the counter. It's no trouble." She sensed, rather than saw, his indecision, and thought she understood. It was probably pride, mingled with a reluctance to draw attention to himself, doing battle with the inconvenience of grappling with the 2 packages and his walking stick. But it appeared practicality won, because he nodded. "Thank you. That would help." "See?" The secretary raised her voice as Harry took the parcels back. "What did I tell you? She's trying to jump the queue." The unfairness of the accusation nettled Harry. Without stopping to think, she held up her telegram form and tore it in half, then again and again. She crumpled the pieces in the palm of her hand. "There," she said to the scowling woman. "Now, I have no business at the counter, so I can't possibly be pushing in." For a moment she thought her adversary might argue, but she merely pressed her lips together and glared. Deciding the battle had been won, Harry turned to face forwards and waited in silence beside the man. When the queue moved, she kept pace with him, noting that his movements were much easier without the packages to hamper him. As they reached the counter, she slid the brown paper parcels across to the clerk and glanced at her companion. "You'll be fine now." "Yes," he said. "Thank you." "My pleasure," Harry said, and resisted the temptation to look at the woman behind them. "Cheerio, then." Still holding the fragments of the telegram form, she made for the back of the queue, which now snaked almost out of the door. She bit her lip. If she joined the queue now, there was no guarantee she would reach the front before the counter closed, and she didn't want the man with the walking stick to notice and realize he had inconvenienced her. More than that, Harry was loath to give the sour-faced woman the satisfaction of knowing she had lost her the place. Yet her message to John Archer must be delivered. Disaster would follow if it were not. And then a flash of inspiration struck her. She could telephone Thramwell Manor once she arrived home and leave word for Archer that Holmes was unable to help. It was not perhaps quite as official as a telegram, but it would get the message across. Thrusting the torn-up paper into the pocket of her coat, Harry hurried out of the post office. But as she made her way along Baker Street, it occurred to her that using her own telephone was not perhaps wise. Mr. Archer might very well try to call Holmes back, and the local switchboard operator would be able to locate the number Harry had called from. It was better to use one of the red and white public telephone booths that were dotted around London streets, she decided. The nearest she remembered seeing was on Marylebone Road, a short walk from Baker Street. Harry made her way there. "Directory inquiries. How may I help?" The voice was so crisp and efficient that it caused Harry to hesitate, if only briefly. "Mr. John Archer, Thramwell Manor, please," she replied, with as much confidence as she could muster. The Directory Inquiries Service had only been introduced earlier that year, and Harry hadn't needed to use it until now. Would they really be able to find the correct John Archer and put her through without knowing the number? "Is that Thramwell Manor, Cambridgeshire?" the operator inquired, after a short silence. Harry was impressed. "That's right. Putting you through. Hold, please." Before Harry could thank her, there was a series of clicks on the line, which she took to be the effect of the call being transferred. Moments later, it began to ring, and shortly after that, an entirely different, much softer female voice sounded in Harry's ear. "More than 4? Hurriedly, Harry pumped some more coins into the slot. She had no real idea how much the call would cost and did not want to risk being disconnected before she had made her purpose clear. "Hello, is this Thranwell Manor?" "That's right." Harry allowed herself a small smile of relief. She'd assumed such a grand-sounding house would have a telephone, but from the single-digit number, it didn't sound as though there were many others in the area that did. "Excellent," she said. "I'm trying to contact a Mr. John Archer. Is this the right number?" The line crackled. "It is, but Mr. Archer is not here at present." So much the better, Harry thought. She didn't actually want to speak to the man. "That's perfectly fine. I only want to leave a message. Will you see to it that he gets it? It's rather urgent." "That might be a problem then," the woman said. "He's in London, see? Not due back here until Thursday evening." Oh! Harry hadn't considered that Archer might have already travelled to the city for his meeting with Holmes. "Is there a way I can contact him? Is he staying at a hotel, perhaps?" There was a noise that sounded very much like a snort. "You could, but I doubt he'd see it. You'd do much better to try his club. That's where I find him when I need him." Harry felt a familiar sinking feeling. His club. Would that be the Garston? "That's the one." It seemed to dawn on the speaker that she had given no small amount of information without asking for Harry's name. "Who's calling, please?" Rapidly, Harry ran through her options. She couldn't give her own name, and mentioning Sherlock Holmes might raise all kinds of questions she didn't want to answer. But the name she used to sign her letters on behalf of Holmes ought to be safe enough. Surely no one would think to link it back to Harry or the bank. "R.K. Moss," she said. "R.K. Moss," the woman repeated, as though writing it down. "Well, like I said, you'll most likely find him at the Garston, and if he's not there, he'll be along at some point. Is there anything else I can help you with?" Harry was about to say no, when another thought occurred to her. She placed a steadying hand on one of the booth's window panes and took a chance. "How is Mr. St. John, may I ask? I was so sorry to hear of his illness." Was it her imagination, or did she catch a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line? The answer, when it came, was considerably less cheerful in tone. "Much the same. We can only hope and pray for a miracle." "Of course," Harry murmured, and tried to recall the exact wording of the first telegram to Holmes. "Mr. Archer said the malady was serious, but I had hoped for some improvement. Has his doctor nothing to say?" A brisk clucking noise travelled down the line. "It is serious, make no mistake, but there's nothing any doctor can do, not with the curse hanging over him." Harry blinked, assuming she must have misheard. "The curse?" "Aye," the woman said with stout certainty. "I fear it'll be the death of him, as it has been for many others in these parts." She sniffed. "Not that Mr. Archer believes, of course, but he will." Her tone left Harry in no doubt of what she thought of John Archer's refusal to accept his uncle's fate. "I see," she said, frowning as she tried to make sense of the macabre prophecy. "But what exactly is the nature of the—" A faint background ringing seemed to bring the other woman up short. "That'll be the nurse," she said abruptly. "Like I said, try the Garston Club. Goodbye now." She rang off, leaving Harry staring at the receiver as her unused coins clattered into the metal tray. Whatever she'd expected to hear when she asked about Philip St. John's illness, it wasn't some strange mumbo-jumbo about a curse. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of thing that happened in a Sherlock Holmes story, however, and she began to have an inkling about why John Archer had sought the detective out, although from what the woman on the telephone had said, It didn't sound as though he believed his uncle was under any kind of supernatural thrall. Pensively, she gathered up the coins and pushed back the glass-panelled door to rejoin the bustle of Marylebone Road, and considered what she had learned. It would be safe enough to call the Garston Club from her own telephone at home. They must receive scores of telephone calls each day, and hers would not stand out. But an idea was forming in her mind, one so obvious that she didn't know why it hadn't occurred to her immediately. She was not able to go to the Garston Club herself to meet Archer, but it didn't follow that no one could. Both her brothers were members, although she couldn't possibly ask them. They had no idea Harry had been demoted for a start, and she feared Seb in particular would never stop laughing if they learned of her new job and its association with Holmes. And it was unlikely that either would agree to meet Archer, at least not without considerable explanation. But Harry did know someone else who was a member of the Garston Club, someone who already knew all about her position as the secretary of Sherlock Holmes, someone who had helped her investigate Mildred's disappearance and pursued the criminals responsible through the shadowy streets of Elephant and Castle, much against his better judgment. Someone who could be relied upon to keep quiet, even if he could also be quite priggish and intensely annoying. That someone was Oliver Fortescue, city lawyer and best friend of Harry's eldest brother, Lawrence. She hadn't spoken to him since Tuesday lunchtime, when she'd all but hung up on him as Bobby arrived with the first telegram, but surely he wouldn't object to attending the meeting with John Archer in her stead. Surely he would understand her curiosity and be equally intrigued, especially if she added the details of her call to Thrumwell Manor. Once he'd finished lecturing her about the stupidity of replying in the first place, that was. But the short-term pain of that was worth enduring to learn more about the mystery John Archer represented. With renewed vigour in her steps, Harry turned towards Mayfair. She would telephone Oliver the very moment she got home. Absolutely not. Oliver's tone was firm. Harry could picture him frowning, his dark eyebrows beetling together in forbidding disapproval. For heaven's sake, Harry, I'm surprised you'd even ask. Swallowing a sigh, Harry sat up straight on the settee and adopted her most reasonable tone. I'm not asking you to do anything unethical. All you have to do is meet this John Archer tomorrow evening and pass on my message. Your message, Oliver said flatly. Or that of an imaginary person? Technically, it would be from Holmes, she conceded. But it's me you'd be helping. I just need to make sure Archer doesn't get angry and turn up at the bank demanding to speak to him. There was a long silence. You shouldn't have got involved in the first place. Haven't you learned anything from the business with Mildred? She had, Harry wanted to say. She'd learned that she wasn't a bad detective, if not quite in Holmes's league. She'd learned how to impersonate a cockney to obtain information, to dress like a man and chase a suspect through the back streets of the city. She had discovered a hitherto unsuspected talent for digging up clues, for following their trail and using what she found to right wrongs. And most of all, Harry had learned she could make a difference, to do something that mattered instead of just finding ways to dodge her mother's matchmaking efforts. I know I shouldn't have answered, she told Oliver, taking a sip from the bone china cup that held her tea. But I did, and there's no help for it. He huffed in irritation, and now she could imagine him pushing his black hair back from his forehead. What sort of person consults a detective instead of a doctor, anyway? I don't know, Harry said honestly, because she had wondered the same thing. I thought perhaps you might know him, actually, since you're both members of the same club. The name isn't familiar, Oliver said, sounding thoughtful.